Alex Farber is the media correspondent for The Times, and he's here with me in the studio. Welcome to you, Alex.
Hi, John.
So what are your thoughts then on the BBC chairman's letter to these MPs and the way they've handled this thing so far?
Well, it was a long letter from Samir Shah to the MPs, and I think that's in part because it was a very long dossier of accusations that was compiled by Michael Prescott. Those dossier leaked to the papers last week and resulted in a string of accusations regarding Trump, but also regarding other areas where he felt the BBC's coverage had fell short, namely in the way in which it's covered the war in Gaza and also on other issues such as trans rights. So Samir was attempting to both reassure MPs that he was taking that seriously and prepared to hold his hands up where he got things, where the BBC has got things wrong, specifically on the Trump doc, which he apologised for, misleading viewers. But he was also at pains to point out that there is a degree to which the dossier is somewhat partial view of the truth, and in the round there is positives that come out of the piece of work that was done by the people behind it, and that's somewhat been lost in the rush to focus on the more negative aspects. Yeah. He was also identifying the fact that, you know, the whole point of the reports that were being produced was to highlight areas where the BBC could do better. So it's only natural that there is going to be a lot of negative points around it.
Yes, the positive points you refer to, the chairman's letter does refer to measures he said are coming or here to tighten processes for quality control, doesn't he? But he does not accept any suggestion of a political or cultural bias at the BBC.
No, and look, the BBC's never done that. They always say that they are doing their best to navigate very difficult issues where, and you know, in his resignation letter, Tim Davie specifically highlighted the polarised times in which we are operating and how that everything is more weaponised than ever before. And so whilst the BBC has always struggled and attempted to chart a course of impartiality through political issues and wider world events, that is becoming increasingly tougher. And I sense to a degree that Tim Davie and Deborah Turness are casualties of that.
If President Trump follows up with the threat to sue the BBC for $1 billion, that case could be the stuff of nightmares, couldn't it? I mean, leave aside Panorama and its clipped speech in the documentary. There's a congressional inquiry and countless thousands of hours of recording of evidence that Donald Trump did incite an insurrection. But the bit of this documentary was plainly misleading. It could be difficult.
I mean, I think it would depend on what people rule to be plainly misleading. I mean, look, there's voices within the BBC that I'm aware of that don't agree with that version of events, and they say, look, substantively, yes, we made an error in splicing together two parts of the speech from far apart from each other, but broadly speaking, we weren't misleading viewers. We were 3 years after the event in a look back programme. We were broadly articulating the gist of what Trump was saying on that day. None of the words that he has shown saying he didn't say. You know, they feel somewhat aggrieved that the BBC is holding its hands up and admitting to wrongdoing. They feel like they're getting a bit of a hard time because, you know, Trump did say those things.
Okay, Alex Farber, great to talk to you. Thank you so much. Now, let me welcome to the programme Ivor Gaber, who works across BBC Radio 5 Live and the BBC World Service and now is an editorial advisor, or a former advisor to the BBC Trust. Ivor, welcome to you.
John, hi.
Good to have you here, Ivor. Just tell me what you're thinking about Samir Shah's letter and the BBC handling of this mess.
Well, I'm reminded for older listeners of what Oliver Hardy said to Stan Laurel, it's another fine mess you've got me into. I don't want to trivialise it, though. This is big. This is a major issue. Working backwards, I mean, there's an awful lot to take in. I think the Samir Shah letter is quite a good refutation is the wrong word, commentary on the Michael Prescott complaint and what's happened. There's an unambiguous acceptance that the Trump edit was wrong. And then the letter goes through various positives and negatives, pointing out other issues, but also saying times when the BBC made mistakes and corrected it. But for me, the big issue that shines through is, I won't say none of this would happen, but the slowness of the BBC response.
Yeah.
Just one example. Samir Shah quotes big reforms to the BBC Arabic service, which has come in for a lot of flack. But who knew? I mean, I'm sure there was a press release somewhere. But did they shout about it? We've reformed the BBC Arabic service? No. Did they shout about their investigation and other things? No. I think it's a real failure. I don't want to trivialise it, but at the very bottom line, it's a real failure of PR.
Do you think there is a bias at the BBC, whether it's political or cultural either?
Well, without being too pat, there's a bias in every organisation. None of us are really biased. I don't believe there is an institutional bias, but by definition, the sort of people who want to get into broadcasting do tend to come from a certain sector. They tend to be graduates because the BBC recruits graduates, mostly in London, because that's where the BBC is. If you look at the demography of young people in London, or 20s and 30s, they're different from people in other ages, other countries. They struggle. They do their best to overcome it, but none of us can overcome where we're born, where we come from, what we think. So I'm sure, well, let me just say, if I might, John, that as somebody who's done academic studies of BBC output, and also somebody who's been an independent editorial advisor, I don't believe, I agree with Deborah Turness that the BBC is not institutionally biased. Does it make mistakes? Yes. Could it recruit more widely? I think so. I mean, it used to have a massive Oxbridge bias, as you might recall. It doesn't. It's much less, but there's still a bias against working class people and against people, I wouldn't say from ethnic minorities, because I think the BBC does pretty well there. But in general, of course, they could do better. And hopefully they will learn from this experience.
Yeah, my memories of the BBC, which are extensive, have a lot to do with editorial leaders talking themselves hoarse in meetings and wanting to avoid bias. But that doesn't mean there isn't an unstated climate of opinion among the people at the BBC there. Do you think future senior appointments are going to be more to the liking of the BBC's critics on the right, do you think?
Well, the BBC's critics on the right are legion. I mean, this has all resulted from BBC critics on the right. But let me say, there is just one example. Criticism from the right seems to get amplified much more than criticism from the left. Obviously, because we've got a right-wing newspapers broadly that amplify it. But when I was independent advisor, just to touch on Gaza without going into it, we had as many complaints from people accusing the BBC of being pro-Israeli as pro-Palestinian. The big difference was the pro-Israeli complainants were very good at publicising their complaints to a wider audience than were the pro-Palestinians. So the impression was gained that there were far more problems from the pro-Israeli, about anti-Israeli coverage. So we're not on an even playing field. The media is not, the print media is not an even playing field. But the broadcast media, I have to say, and I'm not just talking the BBC here, I've worked in ITN and Sky and Channel 4 News, makes me sound like I've been there, I got the badge, T-shirt. But all of the broadcasters, in my experience, really try to be as fair and as impartial as they can. But there's no such thing as absolutes. We try our best, and as you well know, John, we've worked together. We do our best, but sometimes we fall short.
Ivor Gaber, good to talk to you. Thank you, Ivor. Ivor Gaber is a former BBC producer and advisor.